Hello everyone. Imagine that you have a watch on your wrist, and when you wake up in the morning, the watch on your wrist and the clock on your wall are frozen at the same time and minute. What would your reaction be? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Lucia, 38, who runs a small antique shop in Venice, Italy, received an old clock from a customer in April 2025. The clock appeared to be from the 18th century. There were strange symbols on its dial, and with every tick-tock sound, a cold wind was blowing in the room. Lucia placed the clock in the window of her shop, but that night, while sleeping at home, she had a strange dream. A clockmaker told her, "If you turn back time, you will find me," and her face melted and sank into darkness. When he woke up in the morning, all the clocks in his house had stopped at the same time. When he arrived at the shop, he noticed his name written on the dial of the watch. That day, as customers entered and exited the store, the clock began to whisper Lucia's childhood memories with each tick. One night, the clock glass cracked and a pale hand reached out and touched Lucia's wrist. Panicking, he tried to stop the watch, but the hand started to rotate in the opposite direction. When he returned home, he saw not his own reflection in the mirror, but the watchmaker's face. "Your time is with me," the man told her. The power went out and every object in the shop started flying in the air. Lucia took a hammer to break the clock, but with each blow it grew larger. When the neighbors heard Lucia's screams and came to the store, they saw that the watch was missing and Lucia was frozen on the floor with the broken watch piece in her hand. Lucia's date of birth and the date of that day were engraved on the piece. Police investigated, but the watch was missing. From that day on, rumors spread that ticking sounds could be heard in antique shops in Venice at night, and that Lucia's ghost was looking for the clock. A month later, another antique dealer claimed to have found the same clock and soon lost track of it. Imagine walking past a mirror and realizing that the reflection isn't yours. What would you feel? When Lena moved into the old apartment, she was surprised at how cheap the place was, considering she had only bought it a few days ago. It was very close to the city center, but the prices were much lower than the other apartments. She had decided to stay only for a few days, until things got back to normal. The inside of the apartment was quite simple, but it gave her peace. In the evenings, she liked to sit by the window, pulling the old curtains closed, escaping the noise of the city, and just listening to her inner thoughts. But after a few days, she noticed something. At first, she didn't pay much attention to the strange feeling, but gradually, she began to realize it. At night, when she stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, her reflection looked different. The person in the reflection looked like Lena, but there was a void in her eyes. Her face was expressionless, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the eyes were shifting toward her. At first, this didn't seem too scary. Maybe she was tired, or maybe her eyes were playing tricks on her. But a week later, the reflection in the mirror began to get even stranger. One evening, as Lena was just tying her hair in the bedroom, she noticed that the reflection of herself in the mirror was stepping toward her. The more closely she looked, the more real it seemed. The Lena in the mirror wasn't moving, but it felt like it was taking steps just as she was. That night, she stayed awake. She thought so much that by the time morning came, she felt different. She was now aware that something was off, but she couldn't fully understand what it was. Her reflection had started to get closer to her. Every passing night, the Lena in the mirror mimicked her movements, never once taking its eyes off her. There was a fear in its gaze, as if someone else was watching her. One day, early in the morning, she saw something she couldn't believe. There was a red glow on the surface of the mirror. It wasn't just the reflection of sunlight. Suddenly, Lena's reflection smiled on its own. It was a smile Lena had never seen before, a broken, cruel, and dark smile. Lena moved closer to the mirror, almost mesmerized. That smile suddenly took over everything she was. The figure in the reflection continued to watch her, as if it controlled every movement of her body. When she took a step, the Lena in the mirror took the same step at the same time. But something was wrong. This time, the movements were slowing down. Her reflection was slowly starting to step out of the mirror and toward the real world. In that moment, Lena realized, the person she was seeing in the mirror wasn't herself. It was an old tenant who had once lived there and disappeared. That woman's reflection was now trying to possess Lena's body. As Lena slowly took steps backward, her reflection mirrored her movements, getting closer with every step. Suddenly, without understanding what was happening, the red lights in the mirror flared, and the reflection surrounded her. Lena tried to scream, but no one could hear her. As her eyes closed, the presence inside her took full control of her body. From that day on, no one ever saw Lena again. But every night, in the old apartment's mirror, someone slowly took a step. The red lights reflected her figure, but with one difference. Lena was no longer there. She was just a trace, a lingering echo. It's midnight, and you're driving down a deserted road. Ahead, a woman raises her hand, trying to stop you. What would you do? Would you stop to help, or would you continue as if nothing happened? But what if I told you that if you stop, you may never return? Tonight, we embark on a chilling taxi ride inspired by a true event. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, because what I'm about to tell you won't let you rest for a long time. It's midnight, and you're driving down a deserted road. Ahead, a woman raises her hand, trying to stop you. What would you do? Would you stop to help, or would you continue as if nothing happened? But what if I told you that if you stop, you may never return? Tonight, we embark on a chilling taxi ride inspired by a true event. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, because what I'm about to tell you won't let you rest for a long time. Daniel had been working the night shift as a taxi driver for 10 years. This job had taught him the silence and solitude of the city. Driving through empty streets in the dead of night was sometimes peaceful. But sometimes, in the darkness, things seemed far too strange. That night started like any other. It was past midnight, and Daniel had just dropped off his last passenger downtown. The radio played an old jazz tune, crackling softly through the speakers. Everything was normal, until he saw the woman standing by the roadside. She wore a long, pale dress. Her hair fell over her face, almost completely obscuring it. She slowly raised her hand, signaling for a ride. Daniel didn't like the idea of a lone woman standing there at this hour, but it was his job, so he pulled over. Rolling the window down slightly, he asked, "What are you doing out here at this hour?" The woman slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale, almost as if the moonlight had drained all color from it. Her eyes were deep, yet something was missing, almost as if they were devoid of life. In a whispering voice, she responded, "Take me home." If it were me, how would I react in this situation? Would I pick her up or not? Daniel instinctively shuddered. There was something odd in the woman's voice, but he still opened the door. The woman silently stepped inside and sat in the back seat. "What's the address?" Daniel asked, glancing at her through the rear-view mirror. The woman slightly parted her lips and, almost inaudibly, whispered, "Lakewood 17. Daniel's stomach twisted. He knew that area. The houses in Lakewood had been abandoned years ago after a fire. According to the records, most of the people who lived there had vanished in the flames. "Are you sure?" he asked. The woman didn't answer. She simply lowered her head slowly and continued staring ahead. Daniel, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling gnawing at him, pressed on the gas. Throughout the drive, he couldn't even hear her breathing. He glanced at her through the rearview mirror a few times. She was motionless, as if she wasn't even there. The rising fear within Daniel grew as the road became increasingly desolate. By the time they reached Lakewood, Daniel felt an inexplicable unease. It was pitch dark. No streetlights were on. The houses, overtaken by nature over the years, had moss growing on their walls and broken windows. But the worst part was that the house at Lakewood 17, where the woman had asked to be dropped off, was completely burned to the ground. It was now just a barren plot of ashes and ruins. Daniel turned around to look at the woman. "Nobody lives here. Are you sure?" This time, the woman locked her gaze with his. She whispered, "Thank you for bringing me home." And at that moment, Daniel watched in horror as the woman slowly began to fade. Her body dispersed like smoke, vanishing into the air. Panicked, Daniel threw open the door and rushed out. But what he saw next froze his blood. In the taxi's rearview mirror, there was no reflection of him. Instead, it was the woman's pale, lifeless face staring back at him. Daniel wanted to scream, but no sound came. It was as though all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. Slowly lifting his head, he found himself inside the old, burned house. The walls were charred, the floors covered in ash. But the most terrifying part was the shadows surrounding him. Dozens of human silhouettes, burned bodies, were staring at him. The woman was among them, slowly approaching him with a twisted smile on her face. "This is your home now too." Daniel tried to scream one last time, but the darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, the police found an abandoned taxi. The doors were wide open, and the engine was running. But the driver was nowhere to be found. From that day on, it said that a taxi roams the area near Lakewood 17 at night. Some passengers claim the taxi stops even though no one is inside, and they hear a hoarse whisper coming from it. "Take me home, V." Daniel's mind was clouded. As the darkness enveloped him, the last thing he saw was the woman's face, smiling among the shadows. As his mind slowly faded, he could hear whispers that seemed like an echo. "Take me home." But now everything was silent. When Daniel opened his eyes, he was back at the wheel. The engine was still running, and the radio was crackling with static. As he placed his hands on the steering wheel, he noticed his fingers trembling. He quickly looked around. Lakewood 17 was still in front of him, burned and in ruins. But something was strange. The sky no longer looked like night. It had turned a pale, almost gray color, unsettlingly so. When he stepped outside, he felt the ground beneath his feet tremble lightly. Was this real? On the side of the road, he saw the woman who had been sitting in the back seat earlier. But this time, her back was turned. As Daniel took a step forward, the woman's head slowly tilted sideways, like her neck was broken. Daniel took a deep breath. "Who are you?" he whispered. The woman slowly turned to face him. But this time, she had no face. A smooth, empty face. For a moment, Daniel froze in place. He wanted to look away but couldn't. And then, something appeared on her face. Daniel's own face. At that moment, everything became chaotic. The woman, or whatever it was, started walking toward him quickly. With each step, the burned house behind her changed shape. Shadows grew, and from among the rubble, whispers of the dead rose. Daniel stepped back, then suddenly started running. But the roads never ended. No matter how much he ran, he always ended up back at the same spot. When he turned back to his taxi, he realized the engine had stopped. The windshield was fogged up, as if someone was breathing inside. With trembling hands, he wiped the glass. And what he saw froze his blood. He was sitting inside the taxi, but his eyes were empty, soulless. He was different. As Daniel staggered backward, he felt a hand touch his shoulder. He closed his eyes, holding his breath. "This is your home now too," said a familiar voice. And at that moment, the air echoed with a sharp scream. "Yerel Polisler, Turka Dilmus Bur Toxi Buldu. Motoru Kalismiordu Ama Ici Hala Sakakti. Kapilar Ardina Kadar Asikti. Fakat Safer Hikber Yurd Yaktu. Yillardir Bu Balgid and Ladalan Efsanai Gore, Agergase Yarasindan Sonra Lakewood 17 Nina Nundan Jasursanais. Yalkenarinda Duranber Kaden Gorabillersanais. Elini Caldererik Sitsi Durdurer. Ve Ager Durursanis. Sizda Onan Jibio Lursanus.